Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to With That in Mind, the Family and Youth Institute's podcast. At the Family and Youth Institute, or the FYI for short, we provide research-backed resources for Muslim mental health and wellness to reduce stigma, start community conversations, and share the tools we all need to thrive and be well. We talk about
marriage,
parenting,
mental health, youth,
and family.
This podcast is an outlet to share our research and together find ways to apply it in our everyday lives. We'll be discussing research, but make no mistake, these conversations are not just for researchers. They're for anyone who wants to learn about how research can help us understand ourselves and, practically speaking, how research can improve our lives. In each episode, we'll leave you with at least one practical takeaway to apply in your life. With that in mind, let's get started. Bismillah. In our last episode, we discussed patience and what it teaches us about growth in Ramadan. The findings we discussed were from a study where about 200 American Muslim youth responded via text messages to different questions about their behavior before, during, and after Ramadan. Today, we'll explore the same study, but through a different set of findings related to self-control. Here's a teaser. There are at least two types of self-control, and one of them stuck around after Ramadan while the other dipped. And another teaser, we have not one but two guests on this episode. All right, to start or to keep going, self-control after Ramadan. Let's dig into it. Our first guest is Dr. Madiha Tahseen, who, with a PhD in Applied Developmental Psychology, is also the research director at the FYI. She helped lead the study that we're discussing in a partnership with Baylor University. Dr. Madiha, there are so many things that we do in Ramadan that you could possibly measure in a study. Why look at self-control?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, when you think about Ramadan and you think about all the different, like habits that you might hear people talk about, or, when we think of what is the purpose for us as Muslims and what Ramadan is supposed to develop in us, a big part of what we hear and what we get socialized about is self-control, right? Like that's the heart of fasting, is to build that self-control muscle, among other benefits, but one of the biggest ones is really that self-control muscle and strengthening it so that it's something that serves you in everything else that you do as a Muslim, right? As you're trying to obtain Allah's pleasure. So that's really why when we were looking at our different lists, yes, we talked about patience last time, but self-control was a big one that we really wanted to look at and focus on.
Does what Dr. Madiha is saying remind you of anything? For me, I thought of the verse in the Quran about fasting, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that fasting is prescribed for us so that we may develop God consciousness, or taqwa. And in simple terms, taqwa is a deep awareness of God that manifests in many ways, but mainly it should inspire us to be concerned with what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala loves and to stay away from what He dislikes. Now, what's really cool is that the way this study looked at self-control is really similar to these two dimensions of taqwa, or God consciousness. It categorized self-control into two types.
So there is what's called inhibitory self-control, and then there's initiatory self-control. So inhibitory self-control, that's kind of like when you're trying to stay away from something, right? When you're trying not to do something. And so that like inhibitory action kind of gets activated inside of you, resisting temptations that your unique temptations, whatever they are specific to in Ramadan. That's kind of what inhibitory is about. Initiatory self-control is more when you are trying to do something good and you want to stop, but you keep going. Initiatory self-control is like, I want to read Quran regularly. And so in that moment that I get that temptation to not read Quran, I do it anyways. So that's the initiatory self-control that gets activated.
How easy is it for you to stay away from things you shouldn't do?
That's inhibitory self-control, inhibiting or stopping yourself from doing something.
How easy is it to keep doing something even when you don't feel like it?
That's initiatory self-control, initiating or doing something even when it's hard for you. Let's take a look at an example. Remember Abdullah from our last episode? This Ramadan, he set 2 goals for himself.
Stay up after Fajr and read 2 pages of Quran every day.
And
Stop hanging out with friends who aren't good for me.
to stop seeing those friends, that's inhibitory self-control. And to stay up and read Quran when it's easier to go back to sleep after Fajr, that's an example of initiatory self-control. So think of it as to stop is to inhibit, to keep going is to initiate. The study measured these levels of self-control before, during, and after Ramadan. And when we look at the measures of self-control after Ramadan, something really interesting emerges.
Because we asked about them separately, we were able to look at them separately. And what we found was really interesting that they did kind of function differently. And that kind of confirmed for us that you have to look at these processes separately. They're not the same thing, right? Generally, though, what was similar between them was that both forms of self-control were the highest during Ramadan. And that kind of confirms what we know about Ramadan, is that youth are trying their best during that month. They really are trying to form good habits or to stay away from temptations and to do good. There is something about Ramadan that activates this level of self-control. What was really neat was, and this is where the differences come into play, is that inhibitory self-control went down after Ramadan to the same levels as before Ramadan. On the flip side, what we found for initiatory self-control was that it was a sustained effect, meaning it did go down after Ramadan, but it didn't go back to their baseline pre-Ramadan level. The development they experienced in their initiatory self-control, they sustained it to some extent after Ramadan.
Okay, pop quiz. Based on Dr. Madiha's explanation of the findings, if we were to go back to the example of Abdullah and his 2 habits, which habit did he continue after Ramadan and which did he struggle to keep up? I'll give you 3 seconds. What Dr. Madiha is saying is that after Ramadan, it was easier for youth in the study to keep doing something even if it was difficult for them, but it was harder for them to stop doing the things that they were trying to avoid. For Abdullah, this meant that he was able to continue reading Quran at Fajr after Ramadan, but to stay away from those friends, that became harder to do after Ramadan.
When we were thinking about why, right? Why did we find this for initiatory self-control and not for, inhibitory self-control? The thought was that it takes a lot more to stay away from bad, especially if it's a temptation you're already struggling with. You need that intense feeling in Ramadan. You need that intense priming of Allah. When we think of priming of God, we think of, that atmosphere of Ramadan when you're in the masjid consistently, everybody around you is trying to do good. You're hearing the Quran in your house all the time. That vibe kind of makes you think about Allah more. So you're primed of thinking of Him and His presence as you're trying to stay away from bad way more in Ramadan than outside of Ramadan. And that's kind of consistent with other experimental research for other religions, which shows that priming God is what makes it more likely for you to resist temptations. When we think of then initiatory, what we see also consistent with what we've seen with other research studies and other religious groups, that being able to have your initiatory self-control activated, trying to do good, it's not as dependent on that constant priming of Allah's watchful presence. It's the intrinsic rewards of doing good is kind of like a positive feedback loop, right? Doing good feels good, and so you want to do it more. You don't need that intense Ramadan vibe or experience for that, because you're already kind of intrinsically driven to do good and it feels good, so you do it more. So that's kind of why we were thinking maybe the initiatory self-control youth can kind of maintain it after Ramadan. But it's one explanation.
When Dr. Madiha explained these findings to me, I was really curious about how these 2 behaviors differ when it comes to the process of tazkiyah, or reforming the self. What does our spiritual tradition have to say about self-control, and what can we learn from this study? So I took my questions to Sheikh Yasir Fahmy. A little bit about Sheikh Yasir. He's the Muslim instructor at Harvard Divinity School and the founder of Prophetic Living, an initiative that encourages us to try as best as we can to live like our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Sheikh Yasir studied at Al-Azhar University in Egypt for 8 years and became the first American Azhari to teach in the renowned Al-Azhar Mosque. I explained the two different types of self-control to Sheikh Yasser, and here's how our conversation went. Sheikh, these two different types of self-control, do we have terminology for them in our spiritual tradition?
The language that's generally used in these regards are, we have الصبر على المعاصي والصبر على الطاعات والصبر على الابتلاءات. So we have patience that's broken down to three types. The patience that is required to stay away from sin. So you have to exert a distinct type of disciplined patience to stay away from sin. Then there is the patience that is required to be exerted when you're trying to do virtuous deeds and ibadat. And then the third category is the patience that is needed when hardships and difficulties and trials befall a person. So that's language that is in reference to that. There's other language that we have in terms of dealing with staying away from, being disciplined. So we have mujahadatun nafs. Mujahadatun nafs is the virtuous struggle against the self. So the Prophet ﷺ says, "A'zamul jihad jihadun nafs." The greatest form of virtuous struggle is the virtuous struggle against the self. And so this is an indication that the body has within it something called a nafs, a lower self, and this lower self implores and it commands towards evil in a very visceral way. And so the proactive disposition of the believer is someone who literally has to battle themselves and push strongly against urges, desires, impulses, etc. So that's called mujahadatun nafs.
The three different types of patience that you mentioned, does our tradition consider one type of patience more difficult than the others?
I don't know that the ulama have spoken about it in those terms. Each of them are a challenge, and everyone is challenged in different ways. So sometimes you'll have someone who it's easier for them to stay away from certain sins and vices. And so the patience that's required there is less. And for some, it's much harder, for example. For others, it's easier to be patient with ta'at, with acts of virtue, fasting, praying. It's easier for them to kind of get up and pray Fajr, for example. For others, it's a massive hurdle that has to be overcome. So it is, somewhat subjective how each person will be challenged in different ways. For some people, it's much easier to bear the burden of a particular ibtila, a particular hardship. For others, it can be debilitating. So I think Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yuqassimu al-arzaq in this regard. He kind of divvies out the sustenance differently for people in this regard.
Sheikh, so as you're hearing these findings and the fact that for these young people, it was easier to continue doing something good as opposed to stopping something bad after Ramadan, what do you make of that? What are your thoughts?
It doesn't surprise because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He certainly makes Ramadan a space where people can taste the sweetness of living a virtuous life of self-discipline, a virtuous life of worship. So Ramadan, Allah makes it facilitated. He makes it easier. So that's why He shackles the shayateen. He opens up all of the gates of heaven, closes all of the gates of Jahannam. Mercy descends on humanity in a distinct way. So everyone feels that Ramadan vibe, that aura, that kind of, there's something in the air. And that's not, there is something in the air. That's a special quality of Ramadan, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does that for a reason, to give us a real taste of the sweetness of faith, to understand that this is a possibility for us, that we can actually be self-disciplined, that we can do acts of worship that are generally not easy for us. What's expected of us is that after Ramadan, we're going to have to kind of take that charge, that spiritual charge and inspiration, and allow it to govern our behavior moving forward. So we have now some muscle memory, if that makes sense, about what my body kind of feels like when I'm not giving it what it wants, when I'm standing up and I'm praying for an hour or two. On my body, I mean everything, body, mind, soul, and spirit, everything, all dimensionalities of the body, what it feels like when you're sitting down reading Quran. And so you have some of that muscle memory now. You have to bring that with you outside of Ramadan. The most important thing is that you just don't assume that you can do what you did in Ramadan outside of Ramadan at the level that you were doing it. So if you were doing it at level 10 in Ramadan, you're going to bring it down to level 3, because the Prophet ﷺ is telling us that the best of virtues are those that are done consistently, even if they're few. So the whole objective is just consistency now. Unfortunately, a lot of people write themselves off because they feel the drop, and that kind of conforms to a negative talk track that people have about themselves, which is, I'm a failure, I'm never going to amount in this kind of realm of being religious and practicing, because here, I just did all this Ramadan amazing stuff, and then suddenly first day of Eid, I did this wrong thing or that wrong thing. Well, it's expected. I'm not saying it's okay to do something wrong or to fall off. It's expected. The shayateen clamoring to get to people at the end of Ramadan, at the beginning of Eid. So it's just a matter of knowing what to expect, what to know, how to understand yourself, how to understand what's happening kind of around you in the celestial realm, and then to act accordingly. Ramadan may come to an end, but Allah, the Rabb of Ramadan, does not end. So Allah continues. And whatever reality He facilitated during Ramadan, now He is saying, okay, now that you know what that is and what that tastes like, now I want to see what you're going to do outside of Ramadan and how you're going to be.
So, keeping what you're saying in mind, Sheikh, after Ramadan, what's the language I should use to evaluate my behavior?
Yeah, it's a very relevant question. I think the most important thing is that we realize Allah is present. The Rabb of Ramadan is the Rabb of, outside of Ramadan. And as Sayyidina Musa said, God is with me and He will guide. And so here, kind of rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help you through this path, that you're still committed. I want to be committed to you, Ya Allah. I want to be a good servant. And, Ya Allah, you were so generous and kind with me to make fasting and devotional worship easy in Ramadan. And now outside of Ramadan, definitely the challenge is there more. It's a challenge in Ramadan, but it's a greater challenge outside of Ramadan. And so, Ya Allah, I really need your support. I need your help. And, here's my commitment. Allah's a Rabb. And the word Rabb is from tarbiyah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala yurabbina. He develops us. He cultivates within us sensibilities. He's teaching us. It's a training ground of spiritual cultivation and development. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is, if we can put it this way, is very understanding. When Allah sees us fasting, He boasts about us to the angels. I'm saying this just so that we understand how Allah thinks about us, because we don't very often appreciate how Allah looks at us. Allah looks at us and He tells the angels to look at us. He said, look at my servants. They have left behind their desires, their fast, their food, their drink for me, for my sake. So the fasting is for me and I reward for it, meaning that I'm going to reward endlessly for it. So Allah has a very good opinion of His servants when we show effort.
After listening to both Dr. Madiha and Sheikh Yasser, I feel the sense of gratitude to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for giving us Ramadan and for making it so special, for renewing our hope in our Lord, and for teaching us about Him and about ourselves throughout this month. As promised, we'd leave you with practical takeaways in every episode. So here we go. The first practical takeaway is from Sheikh Yasser, who advised that we harness the power of dua, especially the morning and evening supplications.
Ya muqallib al-qulub, thabbit qalbi ala dinik. Ya Allah, you are the one who alters the states of the heart. Make my heart steadfast upon your deen. The dua of the youth of the cave. رَبَّنَا آتِنَا مِن لَدُنْكَ رَحْمَةً وَهَيِّئْ لَنَا مِنْ أَمْرِنَا رَشَدًا. Ya Allah, grant us from your ladunni mercy, from your very intimate, essential kind of mercy and compassion, and make my affairs one of rushd, one of upright guidance, and so many others. But I would encourage definitely the morning and evening adhkar and litanies to be, and to do them with a sense of really getting that fuel, getting that charge, getting that support, getting that inspiration.
And our second practical takeaway is from Dr. Madiha, and it's directed to those of us who have young people in our lives, whether parents, aunts or uncles, or youth directors.
Ramadan is about fasting, it's about sadaqah, but do we talk about it's building these traits? Can we talk about these unique self-control processes, Can we get to that level so then they can build their own, one language internally and recognize these own processes inside of them, but two, making them have that accountability of introspection and reflecting on their own processes and how they're changing and what's helping them and what's not helping them.
Okay, and lastly, this is just a thought I had as I was editing the podcast. If you're struggling with a bad habit, don't underestimate the power of the small, taqwa-inducing experiences that can bulk up your self-control muscles. Having good friends, listening to spiritual reminders on the way to school or work, making dhikr to remember Allah. These are your spiritual vitamins that can increase your awareness of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And like we saw in the study, and like we see in Ramadan, can really help us stay away from the things that we don't want to do. I hope that this conversation has given you insights and inspiration for what it takes to grow and change, especially when it comes to stopping bad habits and continuing good ones. If you like what you heard, find us at the FYI.org/podcast, and be sure to follow us on social media and subscribe to our newsletter at the FYI.org. With that in mind, thanks for listening.